whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
I did not have sexual relations.
On an absolutely perfect phone call.
Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Ciadello.
This week, when is the right time to reopen America and who should decide?
Well, not the Swedes, because they're going it alone against the virus. I'll tell you how.
And pole position, Donald Trump is behind Joe Biden. We'll look at what history says about their chances in November. When it comes to who has the ultimate power to decide how and when the COVID-19 lockdown in America can be eased, President Trump has been saying things like,
The authority of the President of the United States having to do with the subject we're talking about is total.
well, that came as a surprise to state governors and indeed anyone who's read the US Constitution, the 10th Amendment of which makes it very clear such powers are reserved to the states.
Has any governor agreed that you have the authority to decide when their state
I haven't
opens
asked
back up?
anybody because
But
I
no one
don't.
has
You know why? Because I don't have to. Go ahead, please.
But who told you the president has the total authority?
Enough.
Well, apparently that was enough, John, because then Trump changed tack. He told the governors that they'd be calling their own shots, and he even unveiled some new federal guidelines to help them transition back to normal at their own pace. It was a whole new Trump.
And we don't want to put pressure on anybody. I'm not going to put any pressure on any governor to open.
So that was nice. No pressure. How'd that go, John?
I'm glad you asked, Chaz. Within 2 days, he was tweeting,
Liberate Michigan. Liberate Minnesota.
and finally to,
Liberate Virginia. And save your great Second Amendment. It is under siege.
as you probably know, if we go back to the US Constitution, the Second Amendment sets out the so-called right to bear arms. And for decades, Americans have been debating how absolute that right should be. The Democratic governor of Virginia, Ralph Northam, recently signed into law a number of gun control measures passed by that state's legislature, which institutes universal background checks and reimposes a one handgun per month limit on all gun buyers. That is why President Trump is now saying Virginia needs to be liberated.
If you take a look at what's going on in Virginia, they want to take away Second Amendment rights, and that's what they want to do. So when you talk about liberate, or if you talk about liberation, you could certainly look at Virginia as one.
So little wonder then, as protests grew over the next few days, they had a decidedly military theme. Lots of camo, Confederate flags, NRA caps and openly carried weapons. Some protesters wearing Trump gear, others quoting the Bible or claiming the danger of the virus has been overhyped from day one. Some health workers are pretty exasperated at these sometimes quite large gatherings where most do not seem to be bothering to social distance. This was the scene in Denver, Colorado on the weekend as a nurse stared down protesters going to a demonstration there. And an estimated 1,000 protesters turned up in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania yesterday.
People are struggling. It's hard for them to make ends meet now, you know, with all this, with the stuff that's going on here. And it's got to be cleaned up. It really does.
Big turnout there, although according to Maryland Governor Larry Hogan's staff at Carter Hall, there were more media inquiries about the demonstration in Annapolis yesterday than there were actual participants. The protests have the backing of the gun lobby and some business and libertarian groups like Freedom Works, who were behind the Tea Party movement.
Yeah, but not the backing of America as yet. A YouGov poll this week found 60% opposing the protesters and only 22% supporting them. Even 47% of Republicans oppose them, compared to 36% of Republicans supporting them.
And some states are relaxing some of those shelter-in-place orders this week. Georgia's Republican Governor Brian Kemp announcing things like barbershops and bowling alleys will reopen this Friday, with movie theatres and restaurants to follow next week.
By taking this measured action, we will get Georgians back to work safely without undermining the progress that we all have made in this battle against COVID-19.
This is all very confusing to me, John. Why is Trump encouraging protests against his own guidelines, which suggest keeping lockdown for at least 2 more weeks? And what does liberate mean anyway? Ex-Republican, now Independent Representative Justin Amash tweeted, The president uses vague calls to action so he can avoid responsibility and later claim he meant something else. MASH then wrote, just yesterday he was outlining a phased approach for opening America again. He should be specific about his concerns, which measures are okay and which are not. Good question, Justin. Also a good question is, does the president not think we'd notice that the 3 states he happened to pick out were all 2020 swing states with Democratic governors? I am. Look, I get protesting in Michigan, for example. They have some very strange rules there, including shops having to close down the parts of their store that sell gardening materials or paint. But Minnesota? On the very day that Trump was encouraging some kind of insurrection there, the Minnesota governor was already easing restrictions, including reopening a number of outdoor activities. So that call for liberation didn't make a lot of sense, although it did make more sense than this call.
I think that what they're saying quite clearly, when you see the numbers, when you see the statistics, when you see the CDC data is, I want more black and brown people to die.
Yeah, what this situation needs is even more escalation. But now there's something that all those people should be paying attention to. That's testing. Why should we care about testing? Well, what makes this virus such a worry is that you can walk around with it for 2 weeks with no symptoms, spreading it everywhere. In fact, a study this week suggested COVID might be most infectious before symptoms develop, with 44% of observed spreading occurring before any symptoms. And there are a lot of people with COVID out there who don't even know they have it. Remember that corona-affected warship, the USS Theodore Roosevelt? Well, they did something interesting there. They tested everyone on the ship. And now they've almost finished testing. They found 60% of the people who tested positive had 0 symptoms. That is why mass testing is important. In fact, without mass testing, we don't even know if things are getting better or worse. This graph looks good, with daily new cases slowly falling to 0% growth, but daily tests have also slowly fallen to 0% growth. So maybe there are heaps of new cases that simply haven't been discovered yet. But how many tests do you need? The lowest estimate I've seen from a science type was from Trump's former CDC director, who thinks America needs to at least triple its testing rate. That's the lowest estimate. That's a big ask, because America's been stuck on around 150,000 tests a day for over 2 weeks now. But epidemiologists say you need a heap of tests to reopen society, because you have to be able to identify every brush fire out there and then put them out before they become wildfires. And the only way society can function is if all those brush fires are put out. On the other hand, Mike Pence has a different view.
We have enough testing capacity today for every state in America to go to phase 1.
Okay. How can America know when they have enough testing? There's a number that tells you. It's the percentage of tests that are positive. If lots of tests come back positive, that means you're probably missing heaps of cases that haven't been tested. So these countries have a low percentage of positive tests, and surprise, surprise, they're all on top of their outbreaks. These countries have a high percentage of positive tests and they're struggling. And you can see America is right up there near the top at 19%. It needs many more tests. But why is it so hard to get more tests happening? It must be Obama's fault.
Is this a function of lax oversight from the Obama-Biden administration?
We inherited a lot of garbage. We took, they had tests that were no good. They had, all this stuff was no good. So, yeah, CDC had obsolete tests, old tests, broken tests, and a mess. But they've done a very good job.
That was One American News Network, by the way, suggesting that Obama should have prepared tests for a virus that did not yet exist. Andrew Cuomo has a different explanation, involving the private labs that are doing the testing.
They buy machines and equipment from national manufacturers. And those labs can only run as many tests as the national manufacturers provide them chemicals, reagents, and lab kits. The national manufacturers say they have supply chain issues. So what ideally would you like? I'd like the federal government to help on those supply chain issues.
Well, why doesn't Cuomo just buy more testing equipment for the labs himself then?
And I've said, you know, I'll pay. What do I have to pay to get the tests? the national manufacturers will say, well, it's not that easy. I can't get the chemicals come from China. I can't make the vials fast enough. I can't make the swabs fast enough. But that's where the federal government could help.
Maybe so, but Trump says there are heaps of labs that the states can use.
Look at this. These are all locations.
5,000 labs.
That's a lot of locations.
Not so fast. Maryland Governor Larry Hogan says they can't use those labs.
But more than half, most of the ones that they sent me in Maryland were all federal facilities, none of which were state-owned labs or facilities where we could actually do any testing, but I'm not sure what the president's referring to.
And Trump says, yes, you can use those labs.
Some of the governors didn't realize they were allowed to use federal locations. They are.
Someone is wrong. And if they want America to reopen and stay open, they better sort that one out fast.
Well, let's try and get some answers for you. We're joined by Dr. Jennifer Pinto-Martin. She's one of America's most respected epidemiologists and director of the University of Pennsylvania Centre for Public Health Initiatives. Dr. Pinto-Martin, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you so much.
So in the next few days, states including Georgia are reopening some public places with social distancing still in place. In your view, is that appropriate at this point?
So I believe it's premature. I believe that in order to open up safely across the many states in the United States, we have to have a better handle on this virus. We have to understand how this virus behaves a little more thoroughly than we do now. And most importantly, we need to really understand the denominator, the number of people who have been infected with the virus. We have some estimates of that now. We have estimates from all over the world, but we know those estimates are imprecise. And the plan that Trump has put forward for reopening America calls on the states to measure the drop in the number of cases and to use that metric to dictate when they open up or to drive when they open up. And he assumes that states are able to do that accurately and effectively. And the states are saying we can't do it. First of all, we don't have access to the proper testing equipment. And more importantly, we know that not everybody who has the disease presents and gets tested. So the denominator is an imperfect number at this point. And without that denominator, there's no way to really measure whether cases are dropping consistently.
Now, according to the president, the states can use any federal lab they like, but according to Maryland's Governor Larry Hogan, the states can't use federal labs. Who's right?
So the labs are overwhelmed, and in the beginning, we had definitely some missteps. The CDC decided not to use the WHO testing protocol, but decided to develop their own, and all tests were run through the federal lab. When we realized, first of all, that there were problems with the test that was developed, it had some properties that were picking up other viruses, not COVID, and that it was just not able to process the number of tests, we allowed private labs to open up and do their own testing. Those labs had to send their tests to the FDA to get the results. And again, there was a lag. So what happened was the virus got ahead of the testing capacity, and we are still in that position. So I don't know that anyone is right or wrong. It's that neither has the capacity to do what they need to do.
So, Doctor, in your view, how great is the threat of a second wave of this virus? Today, the CDC is warning as things cool down later in the year, heading into winter. That could be when it hits.
So, first of all, I don't think the temperature has any effect on this virus. We've seen it crop up all over the world in all different temperatures. So it's not seasonal in nature, to my best estimation. I do think we will have a second wave and very likely a third wave. The current seroprevalence estimates that are coming out in the United States, and these are very new data, but they're suggesting, first of all, that we are undercounting cases by a factor of 30 to 50-fold. So we are not picking up cases that are very mild or that are completely asymptomatic. But even with that, the seroprevalence looks to be about somewhere between 3 and 5%. That leaves 95% of the population still susceptible to the disease. So we can be sure that it will come back if we're not incredibly careful about how we relax these social distancing and isolation measures that we've put in place. It won't come back quite as strong because there are some people that have immunity, but it's going to come back. And the models that I've seen suggest that we'll go through this first wave and it will begin to drop by June. We'll maybe see another wave in August to September, and maybe even a third wave in January to February of next year.
Doctor, how comfortable are you that a vaccine is eventually going to be discovered?
There will be a vaccine. I can guarantee you that. I don't think it's going to be something that saves the day anytime soon. You know, the most rapid vaccine development was for the mumps vaccine back in the 50s, and that took 4 years. Now, granted, we have better ability to ramp things up and to test more effectively. It's a long and tedious process. There are many people working on it, some very, very good labs working on it. But I think that the 12-month, 18-month estimate is very optimistic. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's very optimistic.
Jennifer Pinto-Martin, many thanks indeed for joining us.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
The current protests against coronavirus restrictions have some interesting echoes of the Spanish flu pandemic of more than a century ago. The deadly influenza strain that would kill up to 100 million people around the world reached San Francisco in September 1918. Within 3 weeks of the first confirmed case, 70 people were dead. Health officials shut down theatres and amusement parks, banned indoor meetings, ordered schools and churches shut. Bar and restaurant workers were ordered to wear face masks. The public was also urged to wear them too, even in their own home. A month later, as the death toll continued to rise in San Francisco, masks were made compulsory for everyone, everywhere. Around 80% of citizens complied. Still, police were making around 100 arrests a day of those caught maskless. By late November, there were hardly any new infections. At midday on November 21, 1918, sirens sounded across San Francisco telling people it was now okay to take off their mask. Schools and churches reopened. Life started to return to normal. Then, a second wave of the virus hit. Infections and deaths spiked. Health officials recommended people wear their mask again, but only 10% did. Deaths mounted. A compulsory mask order went out. Put them back on again. The number of new infections went down, but people weren't happy. Someone even bombed the health department. Civil libertarians complained, so did Christian Scientists. Activists formed an anti-mask league. 2,000 people turned up to protest against face masks. One of their objections, the masks made it too hard to smoke. Finally, the pandemic was declared over in February 1919. Face masks were finally gone. More than 3,500 San Franciscans were dead. Experts say, put together, the shutdowns and the face masks saved around 1,000 lives.
Well, America might be struggling with when to reopen the country, but Sweden never even closed theirs. So how's that working out? To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
Now, Sweden is a very different kind of place, so I've asked for some help explaining it from some local experts, if those experts are ready. Great! Sweden's currently travelling down a very different path from the rest of the world. Their nursing homes, yes, they're closed to visitors like ours. Their unis have been moved online and there's a ban on gatherings of more than 50 people. Fine. But that's kind of it for COVID restrictions. The government encourages people to work from home and to avoid unnecessary trips, but it doesn't make them. Hairdressers, gyms, restaurants and bars, they all stay open in Sweden with some minor adjustments, and even schools remain open despite the kind of filthy COVID-spreading activities that can go on there. She needs to wear a mask. Basically, they're focusing on protecting the elderly. If you're over 70, you stay home. Otherwise, you just be sensible. Now, some think this is all about making those young'uns get sick and then society as a whole becomes immune. That's what they call herd immunity.
Sweden is suffering very gravely. You know that, right? Sweden did that. The herd, they call it the herd.
close enough. But the Swedish Foreign Minister says that they don't have a herd immunity strategy at all. They say that this is about dealing with coronavirus over the long term. As their chief epidemiologist Anders Tegnell put it, locking people up at home won't work in the longer term. Sooner or later, people are going to go out anyway. The public might cooperate now, but the second or third time that you shut down the country, they might just say... Now, you might think, it's fine, there's going to be a vaccine any second anyway. Well, hold on to your perms, because Ian Fraser actually creates vaccines, and this is what he says.
We haven't had much success with coronavirus vaccines in the past. And that's partly because it seems to be a difficult virus to get a successful and safe vaccine against, and partly because the virus infects a bit of us which our immune system doesn't really do very well at protecting.
Ooh. Anyway, this Swedish plan is not to do nothing, it's to make action voluntary. That's the way things work in Sweden, apparently, according to their chief epidemiologist. Their whole system for communicable disease control is based on voluntary action. Their immunisation system, for instance, completely voluntary, and yet there's 98% coverage. And, yeah, he's right, the Swedes do respond. According to cell phone mobility reports, Swedes are driving 34% less, they're engaging in 41% less retail and recreation, and they're going to their workplaces 24% less. But those numbers still significantly trail the numbers from countries like Germany or America or the UK or Italy or Spain, where restrictions are compulsory. And that is why 2,300 Swedish academics and scientists have signed an open letter warning the government. Yes, but the Swedish people are okay with it. 52% of them support Sweden's strategy as of the end of March, and with their Prime Minister enjoying an approval bounce, mind you, of from 26% to 47%. By the way, nice job, Google Translate, on that headline. Do you guys want to try translating that again? Fine. That's probably more accurate than Google Translate anyway. The question everyone's asking, though, is has Sweden's strategy paid off? Well, this is how the corona deaths have been stacking up for Finland and for Norway and for Denmark, and finally, for Sweden. Now, Sweden does have twice the population of each of these countries, but that bump is a lot bigger than twice them. These are all similar countries, similar cultures, but very different results. Exactly. Also, Sweden are only just keeping ahead of the demand for protective equipment. Worst of all, this whole strategy was about protecting old people, remember? But since young people look after old people in nursing homes and the young people are infected, a third of nursing homes in Stockholm now have coronavirus as well. So that sounds like a bit of a failure. Although, on the other hand, with 152 corona-related deaths per million, Sweden, yes, does have a high death rate, but it's still a lot lower than a number of European countries. What's more, their health system, unlike some of these other countries, has held up perfectly under the pressure. And their economy is projected to shrink at 3.4%, which is less than the rest of Europe. So, does that mean that the Swedish experiment may have worked? Tegnell thinks it's worked. He says that the situation is starting to stabilise, although he has said that 4 times before. The truth is, we just don't know yet, because the crunch time is now, when countries such as ours and America start to remove our restrictions. Sweden is betting that we're going to have more outbreaks, and then we're going to have to shut down again, just like Hokkaido in Japan just did. And then the long term will be worse off because of our yo-yoing on and off restrictions. But we're betting that we took our medicine and we're going to move on slowly and steadily, and Sweden just let 1,000 extra people die for no reason. Let's see. That Swedish music was a mistake, wasn't it? Well, if you like the ABBA, great!
Big, beautiful world.
Masterclass, take one.
Action, Joe.
Thanks. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by you know the thing. My new 10-point make it work checklist. You know, I sit on the stand and it get hot. I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun. And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. I just can't figure the guy. It's like watching a yo-yo. I shouldn't have said it that way. That's why we're connecting virtually today. We're going to have to get better at the technical side of this job. But I can promise you that when I'm president, you will. All right, Chuck. Thank you very much.
All right. It's Chris, but anyway.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
The US presidential election process has been going on for more than a year already. Now we know Joe Biden will be the Democrat to take on Donald Trump this November. So, heading into the final 6-month stretch, who is winning this race, and does a lead at this stage even matter? Time for pole position. President Trump starts his re-election race more than 5 points behind former Vice President Joe Biden in the average of national polls. And that's been about Biden's lead since last December, when President Trump suddenly halved what had been a pretty consistent 10-point deficit. Back then, Biden was looking vulnerable against his Democratic rivals, and President Trump was battling impeachment in Congress. Both survived, but how do their relative positions compare to other incumbent presidents and challengers at this stage of the race? In the past 40 years, there have been 6 elections where a sitting president stood for a second term. In early 1980, President Jimmy Carter had been on a roller coaster. He opened up a 29-point lead over his eventual Republican rival, Ronald Reagan, thanks to his handling of the Iran hostage crisis.
The lives of our people in Iran are at stake.
But as that dragged on, Carter's numbers were dragged down. By April, he was just 7 points in front of Reagan, with Libertarian John Anderson polling at 18%. By Election Day that November, Jimmy Carter was still on 41%. Reagan had won over dubious moderates and surged to 51%, while Anderson faded to below 7. 4 years later, as President Reagan stood for a second term, he had a comfortable 13-point lead at this stage of the race over former Vice President Walter Mondale.
We didn't discover our values in a poll taken a week before the convention.
And by November, Reagan had extended his lead to 18 points, while Mondale failed to pick up any more support. The next election with an incumbent president was 1992. As the afterglow of the victory in the war started to fade away, the economy slipped into recession. It was a cluttered contest with a quixotic independent campaign from businessman Ross Perot.
Somewhere out there's an extraterrestrial that's doing this to us, I guess.
In April of 92, President Bush was on 41%, with Democrat Bill Clinton on 26%, and Perot just behind on 25%. In June, Perot would take the lead over both Bush and Clinton.
If the election were held tonight, there is a good chance Ross Perot would defeat George Bush and Bill Clinton in the popular vote.
But by November, Perot had slipped back and Clinton had won, with 43% of the vote ahead of George Bush on 37%. 4 years later, President Clinton had a 19-point lead over Republican challenger Bob Dole in April, with Perot running again but getting just 3%.
Folks, we can build that bridge to the 21st century.
By November, the race had narrowed, but it was still a comfortable win for Clinton. The next incumbent election was in 2004, when President George W. Bush held a small lead over Democrat John Kerry in April. It was a very close race all the way through. In the end, Bush held on to win by more than 2 points. And the last time a president stood for a second term was in 2012, when Barack Obama led Republican Mitt Romney by a little over 2.5 points in April.
CNN projects that Barack Obama will be re-elected President of the United States.
And Obama managed to build on that lead by November. So, what can we conclude from all of that? In all 6 elections over the past 4 decades with an incumbent president running for a second term, the president led their challenger in April, although 2, Carter and Bush, ultimately lost. That's bad news for Donald Trump. He may have pegged back Biden's early lead, but he starts a long way behind, and that is unusual. The good news for President Trump, though, is this. As he proved in 2016, it is possible to win the Electoral College and the presidency without winning the national popular vote, which he lost by over 2 points 4 years ago. That April, Trump had trailed Clinton by almost 10 points. So, he has staged a comeback to win before, and it could happen again. And that is it for tonight. We will see you for a fireside chat on Friday night on the ABC News channel.
And as always, you can see our full interview plus heaps more at the Facebook page there.
Bye-bye.